Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Today's topic, A Guide's Life, featuring Nat Habs, an expedition leader for polar bear expeditions, Eleanor Edye. Eleanor, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much, Rob. I'm really happy to be here. And I guess today I'm excited to talk about me and polar bears.
Well, I think this is great. We're excited to get to know you a little bit. So I think the best place to start is right at the very beginning. So let's talk about where you were born and where you were raised.
All right. So, if any of you have seen webinars with me before, or perhaps been on trips with me, you might know that I guide a lot of our Churchill programs, which certainly includes our polar bears. And all of those trips start in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. And that is, according to my birth certificate, also where I started. So I was born in Winnipeg and grew up just outside the city in what is now, you know, how cities sprawl over time. It's become suburbia. But when I was growing up, there were some houses, there were some recent developments, but there were also lots of farmers' fields still smelled like, you know, potatoes every fall because there were lots of potato fields close by. Um, so that was where I got my start. If you haven't ever flown into Winnipeg or visited Winnipeg, it's hard to describe in a way that you're going to believe me about how flat, and in many cases, like it feels a little featureless in some ways. But I think for me, it's always had a beauty. You know, you always have a real close connection to where you grew up and what looks normal for you and what your landscape is supposed to look like. So this photo on the right-hand side of this image here, it's not mine. It's a Ducks Canada picture, or sorry, Ducks Unlimited from Canada. And I think it really hammers home how flat this landscape is, because this is what they call a seasonal wetland. And if you look at it, you're like, I don't see any depressions. I don't see anything different here. But it's so flat that you just need a difference of a couple of inches in the relief around you to form a wetland that's good enough for your migratory waterfowl. So this is my kind of backyard and how I grew up. So right on the edge of that prairie, we had other landscapes close by though. So we have the Aspen Parkland, we have the Boreal Forest, and it's a place that's really dear to my heart, though I understand if you come from a place of mountains that this might look a little worrying, a little possibly not the way a landscape is supposed to look. Um, but that was my backyard, and that was how I grew up. And I was fortunate to have an upbringing that focused really on an expectation of good education, as well as an expectation that I did spend a lot of time outside and got to be comfortable with nature.
Great. Well, we appreciate you sharing your background a little bit. And so, are you still living in the same area now?
So I live close to it now. I'm now a drive outside Winnipeg, but I'm still in the province. So I have, as an adult and where I'm raising my own family, I am located, it's about 150 miles northwest of Winnipeg. And how I like to describe it is that you're coming off these hundreds of miles of flat plains, and then there's a little hill. And on the other side of that little hill is where I live. And ultimately, this whole landscape was formed by a glacial lake, so it's extremely flat because it was a lake bed. And I'm just up and over where the beach used to be and where we still have a bit of topography. I've got trees around me now. I think I've got a picture coming up of what it looks like around where I live. But it is beautiful. I'm really happy to be there. And I'm happy to give my own children at least the opportunity, whether or not they want it, of having a connection with some nature as they grow up.
I'm sure they'll appreciate it when they are grown up. So before we get into your whole professional life, let's talk about how you spend your time when you aren't working, obviously with your family.
Absolutely, yeah. So I have to say that this picture of a bear, I took this at the end of one of our bear seasons in the past, and it really describes a lot of how I think a lot of guides feel. I would go so far as to say all guides. At the end of a season, we love our work, but we do work hard. And this energy that this photo is giving describes usually the first week or two after we are done working a polar bear season or any other season. So for me, I just wrapped up our Northern Lights season. That started in January and went through just until last week. And I've spent most of the last week enjoying, like this bear, not really moving around too much. It's a, I think for a lot of guides, but we have we love the ups and downs and our personal energy level because it gives us a variety throughout the year. Um, but I'm generally somebody who likes to be active, who likes to be out and doing things. So we just have to take that time to decompress, have a little polar bear nap post season, and then oh, I do have a photo coming up of where I live. So this picture here is taken from my living room window. Um, I think it's quite beautiful. So I do live on kind of a small farm. We have some cattle. It is a family farm, so my husband grew up on that same piece of property. We have a new house on the land now, and his parents still live really close by. But overall, it's just over 600 acres of very mixed use landscape. So you can see from the picture there, we've got some hay fields, we've got a lot of trees in the area, but we also have a lot of wetlands. So like like I think many, I try to walk the talk, and I'm really happy to say that a lot of these lands that I live on are actually under a conservation easement. So we have set aside as a family a lot of that land for preservation and perpetuity. And that includes like the treed spaces and the wetlands and all of the areas there around the creek and what has ended up being a lot of beaver dams. So this is now my backyard, but it's also where I love to be. So I really like spending time at home, but I like being outside at home. Um, it's a lot of space to explore, and I like to make use of that. Um, and there's a lot of wildlife at home too. I love looking at my local wildlife. I don't stop looking at birds. I don't stop looking at bears just because I'm at home. I pull out my binoculars and look at them anyway. This here it's a beautiful owl that's perched right on my fence at home. It's a great gray owl, and as we're coming into the springtime now, I don't know if it's this particular bird, but there's been an owl that has spent a lot of springs with us. Often in the springtime, we have a melt layer that forms on top of the ice or the snow, and it gets quite hard and crusty. And then we have more snow that falls on top. So it's very difficult hunting for these birds, which means that they're the only place that they can really effectively hunt is where there's snow-free spots. And this tends to be around people's houses, around people's barnyards, which means that these, like this gorgeous, like they're big owls, these great grays, will just come and perch on the fence beside my house and watch for mice. And I'm happy to say that I seem to be providing a lot of mice to this owl through probably whoever is staying in my basement right now. So I love spending time looking at the animals in my neck of the woods. We actually have a really high population of black bears. So if I go out in the summer and fall, kind of anywhere around dawn or dusk, and I go for a bike ride, chances are really, really good that I'm going to see a black bear, like really, really good. We got deer, we've got elk, we've got moose. Every so often we get like lynx. There's been a couple of cougar sightings, and there's a lot of migratory birds. So you never get bored if you're happy in nature, and there's a lot of nature around me there. And I do like to say that I do have a lot of wildlife within my home as well. So this is a very chaotic photo. I picked it on purpose. My life often feels quite chaotic. So you can see there's a cat on my lap. There's a few dogs around. What you can't see, there's a parrot beside me. There's a couple more dogs and a couple more cats around too. So I've got my neighbor's dog who just shows up every so often to play with mine. It feels like a busy household in terms of the animal life within the household, but uh, if you travel with me on trip, you know I love dogs, and I have dogs, and I love them very, very much. So they bring me a lot of joy within my day as well. And try to integrate them into how I spend my time outside guiding too. So that's one of my dogs there perched in the back of the car with all of our picnic supplies and our things for the beach and our stand-up paddle boards. And the dogs will, they're, my dogs are herding dogs, so they spend some time with the cattle, but they're also dogs who like a job. And I've managed to convince two of these dogs that their job is to sit nicely on the paddle boards. So you can see in that right-hand image that there's two little bodies just sitting on the front paddle board. They seem happy to do it, and as soon as we start pumping up the paddle boards, they just sit on them and they don't really move, unless something, a bird flies past, in which case all bets are off. Uh, the geese just started coming back here a couple of days ago, and the dogs have noticed that the geese are back. It's very exciting. So they take up a lot of my time for sure, but it's time that I really, really enjoy to spend. I enjoy spending time outside, and I love taking my dogs with me for a walk. In my opinion, dogs just add to the joy of going for a nice walk.
Well, we can see it right on your face as well. And it's really nice to see that you get to go to the beach as well, because when we think about the Winnipeg area and Churchill and Manitoba, we think about snow and ice and cold. So it's nice to see that you get some relief from that.
It's like there's a little beach season. It's narrow, but it's there. So I actually live just south of a national park. It's called Riding Mountain National Park, and that park has a lot of lakes within it. That photo was taken at one of the lakes just adjacent to the park. So lots of lakes, lots of recreational space, and my beach season might be short because I do spend my summers guiding, but for that reason, I really try to make an effort to go out when I'm home during those warm summer months, because those summers are short when you live in Canada, and the winters are very long. So you have to really, really make the most of them when they're here.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. Well, it's good to see that you're doing that. Um, all right, so let's move forward. I'd like to know, how you actually became interested in doing what you're doing. What inspired you, and how did that lead you onto your education as well?
Sure thing. Oh, and I just see that I've got one more picture before I come into that stuff, because one thing I didn't even mention is that I drag my kids along on adventures with me sometimes too. So that is another way I do spend time. Um, I have a couple of kids. They are teenage boys right now, 15, almost 16 and 17 years old. And thankfully, some of them, on some occasions, still permit themselves to spend some time with me. So we do go off and have adventures. So I got my start as a naturalist definitely through school, right? I said before how I was introduced to the natural world, that I think like a lot of kids of the 80s, I was expected to be outside a lot and encouraged to spend that time outside. Um, my mother always said, if you're bored, it's your own fault. Go find something to do. And something to do could be rolling around in the grass or collecting flies or whatever it might be. But I do have to say that I don't know that I fell in love with nature in a way that I realized it as a kid. And it wasn't until I was in school, specifically in university, that I felt those callings coming back. Um, Throughout school, like I've always been, some people don't like public speaking. I've always been a comfortable and I would say confident public speaker. So I knew that working with my voice and working in education was likely something that I would be happy doing. So when I started my undergrad, I was just doing general science, and I thought either probably medicine or perhaps education, something where I get to really use my way of, communicating effectively, making sure that whether it's in medicine and people understand what's going on, or whether it's in education and you're imparting knowledge and bringing people to the table, that was something that I likely was going to integrate into my path. And then when I started my undergrad, I realized pretty quickly that I didn't want to be doing anything with microbes. I didn't like working in the microbiology lab. It's not for everybody. That's okay. And I just kind of accidentally fell in love with plants. And I, for the biology degree that I was doing in my quest to be likely in medicine, they required you to take more than one kingdom. So if you were going to be focused on animals, you had to at least get like your plants or your fungi or your microbiology in there too. So I signed up for a plant course, and the moment I was kind of in front of the microscope, I was like, this is pretty great. You know what's great? Plants are pretty great. Who knew the plants were pretty great? And that was kind of it. And then I went off on botany, and I followed that path. And when I ended up graduating, I actually did it with a double degree in biology with a focus in botany and geography with a focus on soils and biogeography. And that made what was for me a really nice, tidy package of understanding plants and understanding the world that plants work with, right? Which is mainly the soils, the environment around them. Um, and I was really, really interested in following that further. Uh, I have to say, though, through this time when I was doing this, geography has its own course requirements as well. And as one of my course requirements, I was in an Arctic geography class, which was fascinating for so many reasons. And I remember thinking, I was sitting there, Wednesday night classes, and I was sitting there through this 3 hour block of lecture, and I thought, this is pretty cool. It's too bad you can't do this for a living. And that was like the moment that kind of came and went. And I did not grab it in the moment, but I was like, obviously, we come back to that later on because what the heck do I do now but talk about Arctic education and geography for a living? But that was where I ended up finishing my undergrad, was plants focused. I really, really, really liked algae in particular, which I know does not describe a lot of folks. But I mentioned all the lakes that we have. We have a lot of issues and biodiversity in the algae in lakes in Manitoba. So there was actually a really strong focus on algae within our botany program, believe it or not. So I really liked that. But I had some advisors who didn't think that that was a way to ever actually make money as a biologist. And I don't know that they were wrong, but they said, you know what, as you go on, as you're going into your master's, maybe focus on something that has real world applications. And I was going to go to the University of Manitoba. I was signed up to do a program of a Master's of Science in the Faculty of Agriculture that was going to look at erosion caused by large-scale farming and how we can combat the small-scale erosion that large-scale farming happens, especially when, like I showed that picture, right, where our wetland is about this deep. When your wetlands are that deep, you don't need to move a whole lot of soil around to have a difference in the way your wetland functions. So it happens accidentally a lot through here. Anyway, I didn't do that because while I was getting ready for this, there was a visiting researcher who happened to come by, and he had a program that was running out of Churchill, and it was looking at climate change effects in Churchill. And on a whim, I guess it was a big whim, I said, do you have any space for more students? And he said, sure, why don't you come by, check it out. And next thing I knew, I was in that program instead. I was in Churchill like several weeks later, looking at the field sites that were there. And all of this is to say that I still wasn't a naturalist in terms of being a guide naturalist, but I found, like, just through my interest, through accidental things, I ended up falling into a lot of different pockets and being really interested in different subjects. And I feel like it gave me a really nice breadth of knowledge so that when I went through my graduate research and realized that I wasn't really interested in necessarily being a researcher, but I really liked the work and I liked imparting this knowledge, that I could perhaps make that transition into guiding. So this photo here is one of the very few that remains of me. I'm not so good at getting pictures taken of myself. This was me. I think I was probably about 22, located just south of the Churchill Northern Studies Center at a field site in the winter. You can maybe see just behind me that there was what looks like a big box. That's called a comatic. It's a type of toboggan that you pull behind a snowmobile. And we would go out in the winter. That part of the project was focused on taking snow density and snow depth readings. So you'd pile all these volunteer researchers in the back of this toboggan, pull them behind the sled, and you'd end up at these beautiful remote sites where we did this long-term research. And the program that I was affiliated with had a lot of volunteers with it. So what happened was that 3 or 4 times a year, these visiting groups would come in, and they were people who were interested in helping research, in helping advance science, in visiting a new place, right? And so they were there to help collect these readings, to help with the research project. And probably, if they saw northern lights, if they saw a polar bear, if they saw beluga whales, that was icing on the cake. So it was very much accidental guiding that I got into. I thought I was getting into a research project, but I was also getting into what ended up being a guiding project. So at this point, I had experience on the ground in Churchill. I had experience working with groups of people on long-term projects and long-term trips. I had spent a lot of years working at the Manitoba Museum as an interpreter, so I had all of this information that I'd learned over years about the history of Manitoba and the history of the area, and just a whole pile of knowledge that was just sitting inside my head that kind of came out in the ways that you see me now. So when I was up there, we had a variety of projects. One of which for me was planting a whole bunch of seedlings and seeing the huge variety of ways in which they would die. It was a very difficult project because we didn't know how many would die. It was a very difficult one to write up because I had all of these little white spruce plants growing, and I was trying to artificially raise the temperature around them to see how a warming climate would affect these white spruce. But between the snow and the geese and the wind, basically none of them survived anyway. So maybe that tells you something about the fact that white spruce are really robust as adult plants, but they are not so good as little seedlings. That was another study site here that all of those blue flags were seedlings around these pile of trees. And what I was doing as part of that project was finding these naturally occurring seedlings and look at the substrate that they were growing in. If you visited Churchill or if you visited the Arctic, you'll probably know that there's no exposed soil. Everything's taken up by moss, by lichen, by other plants growing on the ground. So if you're a spruce seed that lands, you got to find something that works for you to grow in because you're not going to find soil. And through this, my next accident happened in my career where I had learned algae and I had learned big plants, and then I had to learn small plants, and small plants being mosses and lichens, which turned out to be real hard. They are hard plants to ID, and you have to spend a lot of time getting good at them. And it turned into this 3-year quest to ID all of these plants that all of my little spruce friends were growing in. And when that was done, I kind of poked my head up from that, and not only did I have this pile of knowledge and these pile of skills, but I turned out to have a really oddball skill that very few people had, which was moss identification. And what happened after this project finished, and I moved on from kind of research and education and into, I guess you could call it adult life, was that for many years, I was a professional moss biologist, a bryologist, and I did a lot of contract work for whether it's consulting companies, for government, for non-governmental organizations and conservation organizations, doing identification, doing training, and working on nothing but mosses. So that's me getting my head down in mosses. We have a small group of bryologists in Canada, but we do exist. And that was like all of this took me where I thought I was again going to end. Just goes to show you how life changes, right? And through a variety of legislative changes and changes in the way um, things were operating in Canada, the type of work I was doing was not as necessary as often, because ultimately a lot of it was to do with whether it was new gas exploration, whether it was new mining, new dams going in. So a lot of big infrastructure projects require you to go out and check for rare species first. And we had fewer project starts and we had fewer things happening. And I thought, okay, I'd better find something else to fill my time because this looks like we're having a dip in the amount of work that's happening. And this might be a 1 year dip, it might be a 5 year dip, but feast and famine happens in contracting, and it's time to go out and find something else to do for a while. And that week, Nat had posted a job posting in Winnipeg, and I looked at it and said, guiding experience in Churchill, naturalist experience in Churchill. I got that. What? Why not? I'll put my name in and I'll see what happens. And what happens was I got a call back really quickly and I got an interview and then I got hired. And then next thing I know, um, I'm a guide for NatHab. And I feel like that it may have been accidental. A lot of my decisions weren't necessarily purposeful to take me to this spot. But if you had asked me what I wanted to be doing when I was 20, if you'd said, Eleanor, like, take like family out of the equation, take money out of the equation, like what would you want to do every day of your life? I would say I would want to go be outside and see things, especially in the Arctic, and then tell people about all the cool things that they are seeing. And I had no idea that that could be a job, um, but it is. And that's what I do now. And it's amazing to me every single day that through all of these ups and downs and through all of these kind of fits and starts and learning different skills that I thought would never necessarily take me anywhere, I got exactly where I wanted to be.
You have come a long way from algae, that is for sure.
I still
What an
love algae.
amazing, you never leave it behind, I guess. Well, thank you for sharing that. That was really, it's incredible how one thing just kept leading to the next and leading to the next, and you were willing to just seize that opportunity. I think that's a good lesson for all of us. Seize the opportunities in front of us. Now, you did say you were an interpreter for a little while. What was you interpreting?
Yeah, so for 3 or 4 years, I worked as an interpreter, also as a science demonstrator at it's called the Manitoba Museum. It's located in Winnipeg. And so whenever you've seen like a museum docent or somebody taking you around for a 2 hour tour of the museum, that would be my job. I also work with school groups, so we did specific programming for schools. Um, I was the one making, ice cream out of liquid nitrogen and making balloons kind of shrivel up as I froze them. And so I had a lot of fun talking about science to mostly children, but obviously like adults come in as well. Um, and because the museum that we have in Winnipeg, for those who are like, I know some people who have done our polar bear trips have visited. It's an amazing museum. It's way bigger than you think it's going to be, and it covers everything from the human history of Manitoba to the geological history and the biological history as you cross the province. So I feel like you could drop me pretty well anywhere in the province, and I would be able to tell you what you're seeing because the museum teaches you all of it. It's been, I mean, it was a great opportunity that, again, I'm so grateful for, but mainly grateful in retrospect because at the time it just felt like a cool job that I could have that worked around university. And now I think, wow, like that was years and years of training and years of knowledge and years of learning that I just got to have. And how lucky am I to have had that opportunity?
So, how do you make ice cream out of liquid nitrogen?
Oh, so liquid nitrogen, so it's cooled down to about negative 70, 270 degrees Fahrenheit. Very, very, very cold. So, and I'm probably giving the wrong number for that as I'm speaking, but it's really cold. Um, it's You take your tube of ice cream, you basically pour the nitrogen in, and it boils off as you're churning. So your nitrogen will boil off, but it's flash freezing your ice cream as you're stirring it. So you got to be really careful not to splatter because it's very, very cold. But it's if you ever get the opportunity to take a job that lets you play with liquid nitrogen and gives you access to it 24 hours a day, highly recommend it. You will not find a more fun thing to do than to play with something that is that cold, and you can freeze anything and have it come back. It's a lot of fun, and I really like doing those demos.
Thank you for sharing that. If you try that at home, be careful. It's cold. Um, all right. Well, this leads us to we understand now how you got to be a naturalist guide for NatHab. How is it that you became so passionate about bears? It's not really your background with plants. How did the polar bears become interesting to you?
Yeah. So I think like we have so many guides who work for us in polar bear season, and everybody has had a different path to get to that love of bears and that love of nature. Um, my my passion about bears and my love for telling people about them and showing them to people, like you say, didn't stem from the same background as it does for a lot of others. So when I was working in Churchill as a researcher, I spent a lot of time on the ground with my face in the tundra, looking at plants, cataloging things. And for me, bears were kind of ever present, but they were ever present as a hazard, right? I needed to be, we were on the ground, we were walking around. I carried a shotgun every single day. I had groups of people that I was responsible for on the ground. And so for me, bears were cool, but they were really only cool when you got to see them from a bus. To for me to see a bear on the ground was it meant that I'd probably messed up somewhere and taken people out where they shouldn't be. And it was something that I had to mitigate for, right? So if I wouldn't want to bring a group of 10 people in where there was a mom and cub crossing through or where there was a sleeping bear happened to be by our site, right? So I was always watching for them with an eye for safety, more so than for like showing people a bear. Showing people bears and showing people beluga whales or anything else, obviously on my mind as well, because they're any part of a natural area that you can show people, whether it's mosses or algae or a polar bear. Always cool because it's all part of the system. It's all part of that whole ecology of the area. But when I first started watching for bears, I was watching for bears to avoid them, not to come closer to them and look at them. So this is um, this is a picture here of a bear. I've shown this picture in a webinar before because I think it gives you a really good idea how difficult it can be to spot a bear when they're lying down with all these other rocks around, because bears do a very convincing impression of rocks. There's the bear. Little arrow's going to pop up. So it's always a little, you're always a little on edge, and you're always thinking about bears when you're responsible for other people's safety on the ground in polar bear habitat. Um, so that was really where I started thinking about bears, and bears were just always in my mind, always bears, 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 because you just have to think about bears every single day. Um, but I think what brought me to a love of bears is honestly a lot of what's brought me to a love of plants and a love of nature in general, which is a better understanding of them and a kind of a deep-seated respect for them as a participant in the ecosystem, but also as individuals who have distinct personalities, who have distinct wants and desires. Like we can always talk about polar bears and, well, what would a polar bear do in this situation? What would we expect a polar bear to do with this stimulus? And you can say probably what your average bear is going to do, but they're individuals. They are themselves. Each bear has a different life story. They grew up somewhere different. They learn differently from their mother. They are going to make the best choices that they know how to make in that day and in that moment. And that is really cool to see, like this major factor in the landscape walking past you, and you you get to know them. You get to feel them. You get to feel kind of what their presence is within the tundra, within the Churchill area. Um, so it's just something you can never take for granted, and it feels like you're there, they're there, you both have a respect for each other, and you are both just existing on the land at the same time. And the more you learn about them, the cooler it is, right? Because you learn all about their really cool biology and how their bodies work in different ways to account for their life on the ice and all of their fantastic adaptations for such a long fast, for example, while the ice is gone. And the more you learn, the more you just think, huh, like that's incredible. That's amazing that these groups of bears have had such a relatively short period of time in their evolutionary history to become so well adapted to this, what is in the end a really ephemeral habitat that comes and goes every single year. So I love bears. I hope the love I have for them comes across, because they're really neat. And for me, they're a really neat, really special part of a really special landscape. I've always been a whole picture kind of person, and bears are a really necessary and integral part of that tundra, that landscape. It just would not be the same there without the bears. And I'm so glad that I get to spend so much time with them.
All right. Well, before we start talking about bears a little bit more, let's talk about you for just another minute or two. Let's talk about your history with NatHab. Um, could you remind us again when you started with NatHab? And let's also talk about what trips, besides polar bears, that you lead.
Oh, for sure. So I was hired in 2016, which, if you count your life in bear seasons, which most of us do, brings me, this will be my 10th bear season this coming year. Um, yeah, we don't count years at NatHab, we count bear seasons. So I'm coming up on 10. Um, and I work all of our Churchill seasons, which I mentioned before were the polar bears, beluga whales, and northern lights. And I also work on our Iceland team currently. I have in the past also worked in Australia as well as Quebec. But my current year involves Churchill a lot and then Iceland as well, which every so often also gets a polar bear. So it all comes back to polar bears in the end.
All right, gotcha. All right, let's dive into the trip then. So, do we know why polar bears actually congregate at Churchill?
We sure do. So I'm going to just take a second to kind of orient you to where Churchill is if you've never looked at the map of Canada and where it can be found, because where it is has all to do with why the bears are congregating there, right? So if you look at the left-hand image, I've got a little star over where Churchill is, and you can see that it is located on the west side of Hudson Bay. So Hudson Bay is a really, really big inland sea. It's approximately, like obviously it's not a square, but it's approximately 600 by 800 miles. So huge as an inland sea, but it's also very shallow. At its deepest point, it's only around 1,200 feet deep. So it's almost like this very shallow but big body of water that sits almost in the middle of the North American landmass here. Um, when you look at it kind of in Winnipeg, you'll see that it does not connect up with the road network. So it is a very remote location, even though it is located, within the bottom third of Canada, it's still super remote. And when we go there to visit, looking at the far right image there, we've zoomed into the Churchill area. Churchill further, besides sitting on the western side of Hudson Bay, specifically sits along the Cape Churchill area, which is where you get this kind of right angle bend in uh, in the landscape around, or sorry, the in the coastline around the Churchill area. And that turns out to be a really important spot for ice formation. So Hudson Bay is saltwater, but it is less salty than the Atlantic or the Pacific Oceans because it has a huge amount of fresh water being fed into it by a whole bunch of waterways that make their way into Hudson Bay. So it's salty, but it's less salty than the ocean. Therefore, it tends to freeze sooner around the coastline as we have those freshwater inlets coming in, bringing you water that freezes at a warmer temperature. because salt water freezes at around -4 degrees Celsius, which is around 27 Fahrenheit. Fresh water will freeze at the 0 Celsius or 32 Fahrenheit mark. So all that fresh water really helps with the ice formation. If you look at the left-hand image, I got the star there again where Churchill is. And this is like a historical trends map, but it really shows you where the dates of ice formation happen. So as it's dark purple up top there, that ice tends to form earlier, which makes sense. It's more northerly, it's more cold. But in the Hudson Bay area, all of that early ice formation tends to happen along the western side of the bay. And it tends to happen, as you might expect, from the outside in. So the ice forms first along the edges of the bay, and then it fills in going into the bay itself. And the right-hand image there really shows you where that line can be. Like, it can be quite strong, where you see the ice tracking from west to east across the bay as it grows. When we visit Churchill and we visit the bears, we're visiting the western Hudson Bay subpopulation of bears. The bears who are in the east and the south there belong to the southern Hudson Bay population. So they have generally more ice-free time than our western Hudson Bay bears do. And because the Hudson Bay is so shallow, it ends up with some really strong currents because all of that water is still moving quite quickly, and it doesn't have a big depth to kind of moderate those currents through. This here is the kind of the map of our currents through Hudson Bay in the different seasons. And those currents that we have in the bay don't just affect the water, they affect the ice as well. So when you see a picture of Hudson Bay or a satellite image and it is completely ice covered, just because it's covered in ice doesn't mean that it's frozen all the way down. So only the top 3 to 4 feet tend to be frozen, and it's open water below. Not open, but it's water below. And that water all has currents. So those currents will keep that ice moving throughout the fall and into the winter. And if you look at the fall picture on the right, you can see that there is this predominant kind of southerly current and then a little gyre. So a current that kind of goes in a circle just around where Churchill is. And what that tells us about the ice formation is that any ice that's forming along the northwest coast is getting pushed down towards Churchill and then gets caught in that gyre. So the ice starts to form in the Churchill area first, on average. You know, certainly any year can be different, but on average, that is where we see some of the first ice in Hudson Bay. And polar bears are animals of the ice. Their habitat is the ice. They feed on ice. They would prefer, I assume, a bear has never told me this, but I have to assume they would prefer to never be on land, given the choice. If there was ice 12 months a year, they would be on ice 12 months a year. Because there is not ice 12 months a year, they're going to be on ice as soon as it can hold them and as soon as it is thick enough and big enough to actually support their weight and as a hunting platform. So holding themselves in Churchill and being ready in the Churchill area for that first ice is where it is best for those bears in that population to just wait for that ice. So they're going to be able to get out earlier by being around Churchill.
Gotcha. Well, thank you for that explanation. We can understand that a little bit better. All right. So let's just dive into the trip now. Can you talk about just in general what are we going to experience on this amazing journey?
Absolutely. So I'm always really proud of our polar bear trips. We run a season that runs kind of through early October into mid to late November. And I think that it is a wonderful trip, and I really hope that everybody gets a chance at some point to experience it because it's really special. The NatHab experience in particular, we try to make travel as seamless as possible. Travel can never be 100% seamless because travel is travel, but we do our very best to make things as easy and as quick and as enjoyable as we can. So we do everything from, the moment you arrive in Winnipeg at the airport, we'll meet you on arrival, we'll get you to your hotel in Winnipeg. We have gear that we set you up with so that you're not cold when you're in Churchill. You will meet your expedition leader, somebody like me, for your welcome dinner and learn all about your adventure. And you travel up to Churchill the next day. And we make it seamless enough that we actually have all of our trips going up on a charter aircraft. So you can see here the edge of a bus with a ramp going up to a plane. That is the entire boarding process. So we drive the bus up to the plane. You walk off the bus onto the ramp and up onto the plane, and that plane takes you directly to Churchill. So for anybody who's traveled to Churchill not this way, I can speak to that because I've done it a lot. It is a much more involved process, nowhere near as smooth, and I'm always really, really happy to take one of our charter flights. Um, we have a number of different itineraries that we offer on our polar bear trips, but no matter which itinerary you're on, a large part of your day will be spent on a machine like this. So we work with a local partner in Churchill called Great White Bear Tours. They're a fantastic company that does all of our transport, including on these polar rovers. So these are big machines. You can see a person on there. It's hard to kind of get a sense of scale, but a tire would be about 4.5 to 5 feet tall. They're big machines. They are high above the tundra. All of these windows open from the top down, and that on the right-hand side, that is a back deck that we use for observation as well. These machines hold around 36 people, but we only put 16 guests on one for your day tours. So they're spacious, they are comfortable. If you're going to be spending all day on something, you should enjoy it. You should be able to spread out and not feel like you're packed on a bus with people. It's a really, really nice experience, and it allows everybody to have a window seat, to have a great view out either side. And we're on it generally for, you'll be on there at lunch, you'll have your lunch on there as well. And this is our main way of getting out and around to try to spot polar bears or any other wildlife of the time. So as an example, like here's some people on the back deck with a polar bear mama and cub beside the deck. And that would be that is a very, very nice viewing opportunity. We sometimes get close. We sometimes get far. It all depends on what the bear chooses. And I just spent time telling you that different bears choose different things. So we always allow the bears to choose how much or not they want to interact. Some bears are way more skittish. We give them their space. Some bears are actively interested in seeing what we're doing. They may come over and check us out. And it gives you basically out on these machines from sun up to sundown, because the days are getting short at that time of year. And we're really maximizing those opportunities to be out looking at bears. The inside of the machines kind of looks like this. So it's not the entirety that you can see here, but you can see that it's lots of spread out space, lots of room for everybody. Yeah, we spend a lot of time on those rovers there. They are great.
They do look pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So can you talk about what else we'll experience on a typical day out on our journey?
Absolutely. So I do want to highlight that there are different itineraries. So for those who are thinking about a bear trip, we always have people happy to talk you through what the best one is for you. Everybody starts in Winnipeg, and we have our premier polar bear trip where you come up for either a 6 or 7 day trip. We also have a polar bear quest, which includes a helicopter excursion. Those heli excursions I've been lucky enough to be on them a couple of times. They are fantastic. Can't recommend them enough. But we also have our lodge trips. We have some trips that stay exclusively at the lodge, and some trips that do half time in town and half time at the lodge. And this is a picture of our lodge here. It's really it's stationary. It doesn't move across the tundra. It's taken out there and parked for the season. But it's otherwise quite analogous to a train, right? We have a dining car where you have beautiful meals. There's a lounge car where you sit and you do presentations, or we set up with a scope if there's a bear or other animal around. And then we have the sleeping compartments that are really similar to roomettes. So they got space for you and your suitcase and a mattress, and that's about it, because you want to be out exploring other than that. So it's a place to sleep and a place to organize yourself. Aside from being out and being on the rover, the rovers themselves they take us really everywhere that we want to go within the wildlife management area, which is where we do our viewing. So we're not just watching for bears, though. We're watching for any kind of wildlife, which can include gyrfalcon, can include snowy owls, Arctic foxes, red foxes, Arctic hares. A couple of times people have gotten really lucky and seen a wolf or a wolverine. So there is a lot of wildlife that happens to congregate around the Churchill area. That, no matter which trip you're on, definitely like the wildlife viewing is the focus of the trip. And even when you're taking the bus back and forth between where we load up on those machines, we're still always looking for wildlife because there's no fences out here. They can all be anywhere. And some people have even been lucky enough to look out their window in the morning at a Churchill hotel and see a polar bear walking down the street. So they're anytime, any place. We just go out in these machines for a really good viewpoint, really safe viewpoint as well, because it gets us up and above the level of the bear. And that lets us kind of approach them if they're willing to be approached.
Yeah.
And yeah, aside from that, you'll be busy. There's presenters, there's dog sleighing, there's barely enough time to sleep. It is an adventure where you will be kept busy and engaged the whole time for sure.
So, are you able to recognize individual bears and can you read their body language so you can understand what they're doing?
Yeah, I would say that pretty well all the guides are really good at reading body language because there are some sets of behaviors that are common to polar bears and some that are even common within like the grizzly bears and the black bears as well. Um, for me, there's some bears who I can recognize, especially within the season, and there's some bears that get a reputation because of certain behaviors that they might exhibit. But I would say that overall, like if I saw a bear next year that I'd seen this year, I might not recognize it. They can go through significant changes year to year. They put on a lot of weight, they lose a lot of weight, their shapes, their scars can all change from year to year. So unless it's a really obvious, unchangeable deformity or a scar, bears can look really different year to year. So I would say that you might recognize them within the season, but not between different years.
Great, thank you. Um, so yeah, we're getting a little tight on time, so I'd like to ask you a little bit about conservation. As you know, NatHab really believes in conservation through exploration. It's our mission. How important is conservation to Churchill in maintaining these diverse ecosystems? And are there any ongoing conservation projects that you'd like to tell us about?
Oh, absolutely. And I know that we could talk about this for hours. Let's be clear on that because Churchill does absolutely amazing work with its conservation initiatives. And this is like individuals within the town itself, the province of Manitoba, the federal government of Canada, all are focused on conserving and preserving both bears and their habitat. Um, I think as a lot of people know, kind of the biggest threat that faces polar bears is a shrinking habitat both today and into the future because their habitat is the sea ice and the sea ice is receding and it's less thick and it's maybe present for fewer days of the year. Um, when we look at polar bears, they feel so remote and so far away to a lot of us, but for Churchill, they're there all the time. And if we think about other large predators that we've had conservation concerns around the world, whether it's grizzly bears, mountain lions, jaguars, lions, elephants, um, so many animals around the world have faced habitat degradation and reduction in size of their habitats as humans have encroached on that land. So we know already from lots of experience around the world that preserving a species means preserving its habitat. And for bears, that means preserving the sea ice. But there's a whole other part of it that also focuses on reducing the amount of conflict that bears or any of these species face during the time that they overlap with humans, right? Traditionally, when we think about humans and animals, it's us pushing into their habitat. With polar bears, because their habitat is the sea ice, but they're spending less time on the ice, we have this conflict happening potentially on land as they spend more time on land. So it's really only in the last generation or two that we've seen kind of habitat decrease or changes in a way that's meaningful to polar bears. And Churchill has been living with this reality for a long time, and they are really at the forefront of finding ways and trying ways that humans and polar bears can coexist in a relatively happy way and to stand up as an example to others. So for example, this building that I'm showing here in this image, this building is the polar bear holding facility. Sometimes we call it polar bear jail, but that's not what it is. It truly is a holding facility, and it's a way of reducing conflict between usually subadult bears, just like in the human world. Teenagers sometimes make really bad choices. Teenage bears make bad choices too. And where everywhere else that animals interact with humans in a negative way, that tends to result in the death of that animal. We're not putting humans down when they interact with a bear. We're putting the bear down if they interact with the human. So what this facility does is allows the bears to learn safe ways of being and to stay away from human habitat. So bears that come into town that refuse to leave, for example, might be put into a facility like this. And this has really been a community-led thing. It's been present for over 40 years now. And it's been through lessons like this that other conservation organizations have been able to look and say, hey, you know what? As we're starting to see polar bears having issues elsewhere as well as they're facing habitat degradation in further northern points, what lessons can we take from Churchill? Because Churchill has been living this reality for so long already and has not you can't fix problems fully all the time, but you sure can mitigate an awful lot. And Churchill has done an amazing job with this. So organizations like Polar Bears International and WWF take these lessons into other communities where they fund projects that work for those communities based on some of the lessons that Churchill's been able to teach us. So there's so much to talk about more. That's right. A lot of it's about changing human behavior, like keeping people out of polar bear habitat. But overall, there's so much good stuff out there. And I know all the guides are so excited to talk about these things as we spend time in Churchill.
Great. Well, thank you for talking about that. We do appreciate it because it is a very important thing. Um, so let's get back to the trip. I'd like to know what your favorite part of leading this trip is.
Oh, my favorite part is always that moment where I can see it in people's faces and in their eyes that they have found that moment of connection that they were maybe hoping for. Maybe it came in a different way than they expected. But to help people find a meaningful connection with the bears, with the land, with this community of Churchill, um, often people think they come for the bears, but they leave saying that something else was the most meaningful to them, right? Maybe it was the northern lights that happened to pop out that night. Maybe it was making a connection with the town and the people living in Churchill. Maybe it was learning about conservation initiatives. Maybe it was going for a dog sled ride. But that point of connection when people are leaving having had that moment, and just like our mission says, right, conservation through exploration. When they leave with that little piece of Churchill inside their heart, they're going to carry it with them forever. And you can't not be different when you have that in your heart.
So is there one special moment or unique experience that really stands out to you in all these years of guiding up there?
Oh my gosh, there's so many. Every trip has its own. I'm gonna pick one that it's not a deep, meaningful thing. It was just a really fun moment. A few years back, we had some cold weather early on, and we had these five subadult bears who were clearly recently weaned from their moms, who all ended up coming together and having a big old play on a frozen lake. And I'd never seen anything like that since. I don't know that I'll ever see anything like that again. But to see five young bears who, if you look at this picture, like they are fat bears. They were in good shape, they were happy, they were healthy, and they just wanted to have a good play. And we watched them for a couple hours until they got tired. It was just wonderful. But you know, everybody finds a special moment. That one was mine from that trip, but there's so many that have come up.
Wow, that is incredible. So Um, I'm sorry to have to speed up this because we're really at it, but is there anything that you would like our guests to know that you think is important before they actually come up to Churchill?
What I'd like you to know is that it will be a different habitat than you've ever stepped in before. It is near and dear to so many hearts, but it feels really stark when you get there. It is beautiful, but it's beauty in a different way, and I hope it grabs you, and I hope you feel it. Um, but it is a very different place, and my what I'd like you to know is just that if you are open to new experiences, Churchill's going to sneak right in there and you'll have a hard time walking away from it.
It it is breathtaking. And I'm excited to come up there at some point to visit you. So tell me, what does the future hold in store for Eleanor?
For me, short term vacation, I'm taking some time and I'm going to Australia in 2 days, provided the snow does not get in my way. So I've guided here before and I'm going back with my family to go have a fun time for a few weeks. Long term, I'll be right back there in Churchill, so you can look for me next time you come up.
Excellent. That sounds wonderful. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time that we do have for today. If I didn't get to your question during the presentation, I do apologize. Th we appreciate you taking part and putting some absolutely wonderful questions in there. And Eleanor, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to present for us today. Thank you for letting us to get to know you just a little bit better.
Well, thanks everybody, and thanks, Rob.
Absolutely. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. So if you are interested in information on how you can travel and visit Eleanor and see the polar bears, please give us a call at the number on your screen, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us Monday for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out next week's lineup, including our registration links on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude today's webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.